Welcome to our session, Assessment of Language, Language Sample Analysis. I'm Andrea Bertoni, the Speech and Language Consultant at the Department of Public Instruction, and we are joined with by Dr. John Heilman from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who's going to talk with us at length today about language sample analysis. I'd like to give WISPE, the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative, a shout out. Thanks for letting us use your Zoom account. These are, to me, the biggest or most important documents you could look at or share with supervisors about speech and language impairment and the rule change and what does that mean. The bottom one I'm updating, and I'm trying to communicate with everyone about the assessment tools webpage is where we're providing our resources. And today we're going to be talking about language impairment, which is one of the 5 areas that are part of speech or language impairment. And I wanted to point out that there's a lot of guidance that we've put out and we've talked about around this area, right? We've talked a lot about educational performance. We've talked about dynamic assessment. And so if those are topics you're interested in, those are on our website as resources. There are videos, there are written documents, depending on what would be useful for you. John also wrote for DPI the criterion referenced assessment document, and that we can reshare again. And then we also have done some work on the significant discrepancy that I do believe we're going to have to circle back around and clarify for people, because I do think that's still a sticking point. But today we're going to highlight what is letter A, language sample analysis. And I'm excited that we get to have Dr. John Heilman with us to talk about this topic. John, I think you've dedicated your career to looking at language sample analysis, haven't you?
Pretty much so, yeah. Thank you for this opportunity. Like Andrea said, I've given a lot of thought to language sample analysis over many, many years. The past 3 to 5 years, I've really been thinking a lot about, what can we do as researchers and as academics to partner with school districts and with DPI to make these practices work in your day-to-day lives. This is kind of an intimidating presentation for me to give because I don't really know where you are, but then I thought I do know where most of you are. There's been several studies that have looked at the use of language sampling within the public schools. We know that speech language pathologists overall see the value of language sample analysis. That's been a consistent finding. I know everyone here sees the value of it, being here late on the afternoon. We know that you're very busy and it's hard to find the time to do language sample analysis. So my approach for today is to first recognize the benefits of language sampling. Like I said, I know that you know the value of it, but to really see where it falls within that comprehensive assessment and really where it can add value to our clinical practice. Then we're going to jump right into trying to find a very feasible way of getting you using language sampling next week if you want to start using it. So we're going to talk about some different measures that have been used that where you can analyze a language sample by simply using a rubric. So by not fully transcribing the sample, but rather collecting a sample and using a rubric so that you can feasibly collect an individual language sample. Now, rubrics are great, but there is a lot of added value that you can get from transcribed language samples. So I want to talk through what that added value is and why you might want to consider it or expanding the use of transcription. And then finally, at the end, we're going to talk about some different strategies that you can use for increasing the use of language sample analysis. So hopefully everyone will be able to take something away from this. If you're not using language sampling at all, we'll give you some very practical tools and strategies so that you can start collecting language samples, like I said, next week. If you are doing language sampling and are doing transcription, hopefully you can take away thinking about some different contexts, some different types of language samples, some different tools. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we get started, I don't really have any financial disclosures. I don't make any money from any language sampling software or product. I don't own any products. I do have a relationship, a non-financial relationship with the SALT team, where we've collaborated on research over the years. So just to get that out of the way. So the first objective is to really think about the benefits of language sampling and what that looks like within the comprehensive assessment. So if we look at the IDEA criteria and the guidance, it tells us that no single measure or assessment should be used as the sole criterion. This has been the common theme throughout this past year, is that we need to complete a comprehensive assessment. We need to look at multiple pieces of data, and in particular, pieces of data that document the educational impact of a disorder. And language samples are great because they can do both those things. They can help us identify disorders, and they can also help to document that educational impact. We've talked a lot about the comprehensive assessment model, where we can get these different pieces of data. We can get our language probes, our language samples within those probes, so actually seeing real life communication. We can combine that with our norm reference tests, with our observation of academic performance, looking at some criterion reference assessments, and get that full picture. This isn't just us that have made this up or have thought about it. This is something that's being widely described in the literature. This is a really nice article describing the converging evidence framework. And as you see in here, it's bringing in multiple sources of data and with analysis of connected speech and language production within there. So when we're doing our comprehensive assessments, the clinical question that we're asking ourselves is, A, is there a significant discrepancy? Are we seeing the presence of a disorder? And B, what is the educational impact of that? This is very consistent with the IDEA terminology as well of identifying a disorder. Is there a significant impairment, and does that impairment have an educational impact? This is consistent with what we have in the rubric here to guide these decisions. And you can see that we can combine this information. So this is just reiterating all of these points that we're really focusing on that comprehensive assessment. So if I'm here preaching about language samples, what's my beef with norm reference tests? What's wrong with norm reference tests? I'm here to reaffirm, in many cases, nothing is wrong with norm reference tests. They can provide a very important piece of that comprehensive assessment. But we also need to acknowledge that those norm reference tests, they can be biased for students who speak multiple languages, students who speak non-mainstream dialects, students who don't have a lot of familiarity with those norm reference standardized tests. In those cases, there are some advantages for language sampling. If we think about, I was just talking with a clinician today who had a student who was new to school and having difficulty performing on these standardized tests. But she saw a very different picture of this student when having a conversation, when engaging in discourse. Discourse tends to be more universal. It's a very naturalistic task compared to those norm reference tests. If you have a student tell a story, for example, narratives and stories are something that are relatively universal across cultures. The other thing is that there's a lot of issues when we translate tests. So language samples are more open-ended, and they can accommodate a range of languages spoken and dialects. So when we're trying to identify that impairment, there are some real advantages to using a language sample. For me, the real power of a language sample for most of our students is documenting that educational impact, right? And like I've highlighted to you already, this is something we need to do when we are determining if a student is eligible for services. But Also, where I get really excited is this is where we can really find some meaningful treatment objectives. I know I in the past have written treatment objectives from my norm reference tests, and in hindsight, they always weren't the most functional or meaningful. If we can get a glimpse into a student's ability and profiles of strengths and weaknesses on these meaningful tasks, they can lead to meaningful interventions. So what is the educational impact? Where am I coming up with this from? Well, one thing we can think about is that students, they have to use language throughout the day. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but we know all of these different ways that language finds itself in the curriculum and in the day-to-day lives of our students. It can be students having a discussion about literature or planning a group project. It could be kids playing, preschoolers playing in circle time or doing group work and having to negotiate. It could be students getting up in front of the class and doing a report or sharing the information that they know or negotiating with their peers or their teachers. Language is everywhere in our curriculum. Our kids with language disorders, our students with language disorders, they are having difficulty fully accessing that curriculum because their language is getting in the way. What we're doing with language sample analysis, it's kind of easy to lose the sight of this. We're taking a sample, right? So if we think back to our research methods, a sample is a small part of that broader population. So if we think of all of the dots here on the left side of your screen as all of the communication throughout the day, what we're doing with our language sample is we're trying to get a small sample of that we can analyze in a relatively easy way and get a glimpse of the types of difficulties the students are having. So putting the sample into language sample analysis, we're trying to take a sample of that meaningful communication that our students are having throughout their day. So in the following examples, I'm going to give some different examples of educational tasks, and I pulled some examples from the Common Core. These coincide very closely with the Wisconsin academic standards. And then I'm going to think about how they may relate to different types of language sampling tasks. So from the Common Core, English language arts, kindergarten competencies, we know that students are expected to participate in conversations. They're supposed to be able to listen to each other, take turns, and continue through multiple exchanges. So it's generally widely accepted that this is a skill that kindergartners should have. When we think about the educational impact that we might observe in a language sample, we might see that students, they are not participating fully at educational classroom centers. We might see that the student's voice is not heard because they aren't engaging with their teacher. We might see that our students aren't able to share their point of view with their broader classroom community. So these are all the ways that you have observed your students having difficulty in their classroom. And these are the types of things we're trying to sample with our language sample analysis. How can we capture these difficulties that they're having in a systematic way and document the difficulties they're having or the absence of difficulties? And how can we develop profiles of relative strengths and weaknesses? Narrative, another very common part of the curriculum. Storytelling is a big part of the general curriculum. Being able to recount experiences, adding facts, adding rich description. So being able to tell a story is what we expect our students to do, right? And what are the types of difficulties we're seeing them have? If we're working in early childhood, we might see decreased engagement in story time. Now, narratives aren't isolated to early childhood. When children are starting to learn to read, they're going to have difficulty comprehending what they're reading or describing what they're reading to enjoy and have a meaningful experience with that literature. This also can translate to written language. They may be unable to write about personal experiences they've had, share their point of view. If you don't have a good understanding of how narratives work, of how to understand narratives, it's going to have a real life impact within your classroom setting. And especially, narrative we know has special importance. We know within our scope of practice, reading is a big part of what we can do. We also know in our day-to-day practices, we're not reading specialists. We generally don't do reading instruction. But our students with language disorders and other communication disorders, they often have difficulty with reading outcomes. They also often have reading disorders. What can we do to help build that foundation for their reading ability, build their foundation in knowing stories to help build them up and be able to access that curriculum better? One more here, expository. So, those of you here who are with older students know that your students need to be able to present information, findings, and support their evidence. So, students with language disorders, you've seen their presentations and them be disorganized and have a limited impact on their peers and their teacher. I was thinking of this one. My daughter was describing the strategy they had for, this classroom challenge. And if you don't have the language skills to be able to participate in that, you're not going to be able to contribute. Our students have great ideas and they can make great contributions. If their language is getting in the way from that, that is having a significant impact. Expository, as we switch into middle and high school, our reading and our writing gets to be in the form of exposition. If you have difficulty with that, you're going to have difficulty accessing that information. So just as a reminder, when we're thinking about language samples, when we're thinking about all of these different places they show up in the curriculum, when we go through these different tools, we're able to identify the presence of an impairment and the educational impact, which makes these such powerful tools. All right, let's get right into some tools. What are some things you can use? What are some things you could add to your practice? We're going to start with rubrics, and you all know what rubrics are, right? You see these throughout your student's day. You had these in your university. You had them in high school. I saw some of my former students' names in there. They had me give them rubrics. So these are a way of having a somewhat objective method of evaluating performance. And we find them throughout the school, right? So in our school, for example, I just pulled this generic third grade informative explanatory writing rubric. The teacher that you're collaborating with, your student's teacher, they very likely are using rubrics for explanations, persuasions, stories. They're either evaluating performance with rubric or using rubrics to help set the expectations. So these could be a great resource for you to start getting some sort of evaluation on what they're doing in the classroom. What I'm going to focus on today are some what I call proprietary tools, some tools that were developed and published by researchers and publishers. This one that I'm showing here is called the narrative language measure, and I'll get more into that in just a bit. The first one that I want to share, and I also want to say that all of these are available on the handouts. I'm going to scroll over to the handout in the participation folder real quick. If we look at that handout, hopefully you can see this, and you go down through here, you can see the narrative assessment protocol, this first one I'm talking about. There's a link right there to the site, and there's links to all of these materials available for you. The narrative assessment protocol, this was developed as part of a research study and then was refined to become a clinical tool. The motivation for doing this was to get a feasible way of collecting language samples and analyzing language samples that people can work into their clinical practice. One thing you'll notice with these protocols is these are going to look a lot like your norm reference test. So if you have some PTSD from language sample analysis from grad school, let's try to think of how we can merge our competencies and that we feel comfortable with into administering these language samples. This makes me feel good. This makes me get warm and fuzzy inside when I see different color text saying what I'm supposed to do and what my script is. It just is comfortable to me. And that's what these protocols have as well. So you see here the NAP, the narrative assessment procedure. It introduces the tasks. It provides the expectations to the students. It gives you guidance on what types of prompts you can give and what type of criteria means you can stop sampling from the student. They have, I believe, 4 different stories for you to use. So as you can see in this picture, it's a story about a raccoon and her friends, and they're out playing soccer. And as you can see in the second picture, they're starting to get hot. That goes along well with the script. So one hot summer day, Rachel Raccoon and her 3 best friends were playing soccer. The sun was beating down and everyone was getting hot and sweaty. So we're setting the stage. We have a problem that everyone's getting hot, and then we're going to have some sort of solution. Suddenly, Rachel had an idea. Let's have some lemonade. And the story ensues from there. So we read the story to the students. Part of this assessment is capturing how well are they comprehending the story. And then we ask them to retell that story back to us. How do we score the NAP? So this is just a screenshot from the materials that I got free from their website. You can go onto the website, create an account, and you can download all of these materials yourself. You'll see that it has multiple aspects of narrative features that we look for. So it has things like, are they opening their narrative well? Are they referring to the characters? Within this, are they using some different features we might expect, such as similes and metaphors? Are they referring to time sequences? And then really focusing a lot here at the bottom on how are they developing that plot? So one really nice thing with these rubrics, and this one in particular, is it helps remind us of all of those features of narrative that are important. In order to tell an effective story, you need to include a lot of these things. This also was developed and tested on children with disorders, on students with disorders. So we know that students with language disorders, they tend to have difficulty and tend to not include a lot of these features into the stories that they tell. So just to zoom in a little bit, you can see what some of these scoring features are, or what some of these features that you score include. And they include some of those features that we look for in our narratives. Just to show you how this site is organized, when you go onto the site, they have all of the different administration materials there for you. They have these 4 different scripts that go with these 4 different stories. They have pictures available for you to use and scoring forms for you to use. There is an expectation that you complete some training. Now, this isn't a 6-week training where you learn the ins and outs of how to give every assessment. This is a very specific training. I went through the training in about 45 minutes, talks a little bit about, the administration processes, coding, practice coding. It gives you time to practice doing the coding to make sure that you're calibrated. So just as we wouldn't pick up the new test that I'm developing, I'm not really developing, but I want to develop it, the language of literacy test, the LOL. But just as you wouldn't pick up the new LOL and just go in and administer it, this new tool is going to take a bit of time for you to get up to speed with. So all of the materials are there, all of the training's there. It takes a bit of time, but once you get it, it's quick and easy to administer and complete the assessment. They also provide benchmarks. So they provide norm reference data for you to compare your students' performance to. This is normed on students from 3 to 7 years of age. So those of you working in early childhood up through early elementary, this is a tool that you could work into your clinical practice. I want to give a second example of a tool that, again, you can start using immediately. These are called the narrative language measures. So some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the Language Dynamics Group. Doug Peterson and Trina Spencer, you may have seen some professional development, or if you're on social media, have seen some of their materials. They have this is primarily an intervention program. You may have heard of Story Champs. But what I really like about this package that they have is that they have some assessment materials available. So they call it the cubed assessment. it looks at a variety of language and literacy, but within that, they have something called the narrative language measures. So within the narrative language measures, they have stories that go along with these pictures, and then a script that you read to the students. So you can see that, there's the setting, there's some sort of problem, there's some sort of response to the problem, and then a solution and a resolution. We know those are the key features of stories. And you see that it has the script here that you can read. And then as the student is telling that story back, it has some coding that you can do. So you can see, are they including the characters and the settings? Are they identifying the problems and the responses, the mental states, the feelings? Are they including these different parts? It also has some different language features. So you can rate for whether they're including some different conjunctions, subordinators. Are they using some higher level vocabulary items in their stories? And they also have some comprehension items. These items are all freely available on their website. Some things are available to purchase and you have to purchase, but these narrative language measures are things that you can download and again, start using next week. They do provide benchmark data for pre-K through third grade. So similar is the narrative assessment procedure or the NAP. And one really nice thing is they have alternate forms available. So they've developed all these different stories that have the same features. So you can give multiple stories for progress monitoring. And they also have published research on using these materials in the other new part of the criteria, dynamic assessment, right? So you could collect some of these stories, either do immediate intervention or trial intervention, or as you're doing interventions, see, are they responding to that intervention? And can that help you with some of your diagnostic decision-making? So you might be like, well, that's great. Is that all that we have out there is narrative? I work with middle schoolers and high schoolers. Yes, there is. So when we get into the older students, we often are thinking about different types of language. When we think back to the curriculum tends to change from more of a focus on narrative into more of a focus on expository and persuasion. So I'm going to share some of our own work that we've done developing students' technical descriptions, so their expositories, as well as their language used to motivate people to either change their position or to act or change their point of view, known as persuasion. So these tools are, again, freely available. These are free tools that are available. The link is in the handout. If you go on the SALT website and go on the resources tab, you will find all of the elicitation materials and all of the rubrics that have been used with the different SALT elicitation methods. One thing to note is that these were all developed with input from clinicians, and here in our fair state of Wisconsin, the early conversations and narratives were developed mainly in the Madison area. The expository and persuasion was developed with the retired SLP, Tom Malone, who was really involved. The point of this, besides to show how much my beard has gotten gray in the past 6 years, is to let you know that these aren't just things that we just made up and pulled out of the air. These were things that were developed in tandem with clinicians practicing in the schools. So I want to talk to you a little bit about expository, our expository language samples. One thing we did with the expositories was develop a planning sheet, okay? So we have these, just like we saw with those narrative tools, we have standardized administration methods. We have ways of collecting these data and ways of encouraging you to collect them that follow a standardized procedure. We do this because we want to make it easier on you to collect these samples. We also want to promote consistency. right? Why do we do things in a standardized way? Well, we do them in a standardized way so we can compare from time A to time B to time C. Or if we're comparing to some sort of normative database, we can see how our student does and how does that compare to their typically developing peers. So within that SALT website and on the links, you can find these different elicitation materials. The other thing we wanted to do is thinking about the curriculum and thinking about what school tasks are like, especially for older students. They're not told to, just say, hey, Johnny, come down here and explain to me how you play this game. No, they're told, okay, we're going to do this task where you have to explain this game. And, these are the things that we expect from you. We are making the expectations very clear to you. So the expectations are known to the students, all the things we want them to include. This particular task that we use is describing their favorite game or sport. And then once they complete this, once they describe their favorite game or sport, we developed multiple rubrics. And I know this might be a lot to look at. What you're seeing on the left side of your screen is the full rubric. So I just wanted to show you how you can evaluate 7, 8, 9 different aspects of expository discourse. And then I wanted to zoom in so you can see what they look like. So for example, when someone's describing their favorite game or sport, a key part of a technical description, especially of something like a game or sport, is to describe the object of the game. What's the point of what you're trying to describe, right? And when we're evaluating that, we want to say, okay, did they do a really good job? Did they get a score of 5? Did they do an okay job, score of 3? Or did they kind of bomb this, a score of 1? So our approach has been to give these anchors to know where your student is performing compared to the expectations. Persuasion, so persuasive language samples. This was another task that we developed, try to persuade an authority figure to either change their point of view or to take action. We gave the students a list of different topics they could talk about starting the school day later. It could be something like change to the dress code, increasing my hourly pay, access to free broadband or access to broadband internet, all types of different topics were out there. Again, standardized protocol for collecting these. We gave them a planning sheet so the expectations were clear. And then we can capture how is the student engaging in this persuasive discourse. And we have a very similar rubric here as well. All right. So I'm not going to go into the details of all of these. I just want to show you what these materials look like. So what's a way that we can get this worked into your clinical practice in a feasible way? So the first two, those first two narrative procedures, those were designed specifically to be used without transcription, to be used by just evaluating their productions. That being said, I find myself having a really difficult time doing it in real time. So what I tend to do is we'll record the student's sample, go back and listen, and I can pause it or I can go back and play what they did. I think that's especially important for these expository and persuasive samples. There's no data out there saying that these are completely accurate when you do them without transcription. These were designed for transcription. But being a pragmatist and in the real world, I think it would make sense in order, if you wanted to try this, to take a first step of following the protocol, collecting a sample, recording that sample, and seeing how you can grade and score using this rubric without going through the process of transcription. Throughout the session today, I'm going to talk about a student named Will. Okay, and I'm going to try to have Will be a pretty straightforward student. Will is in kindergarten, and we suspect that he has a language disorder. You administered the self-P. This is not a commentary on the self-P. This is neither endorsement or a criticism, but I could see it very easily be in our clinical practice where we would give the self preschool and we observe a standard score, standard score 77. So, fairly notable, if not significant discrepancy from his typically developing peer. I have a good suspicion that these data were valid. He had difficulty across the range of subtests. So we know that in the self-P, you have to repeat some sentences, you have to produce some inflectional morphemes. We saw that he was having difficulty with these types of tasks. So why do the language sample? What value do you get? Why is this worth the investment of your time and your focus? So as we go through this, I'm going to demonstrate how these language samples add some value. And I, spoiler alert, believe that they truly do add value and hope that I can convince you that they add value. So if we're giving the narrative assessment protocol, we can see that Will really struggles with all of this plot development. And as we listen to it, we notice, gosh, he's really just describing the pictures. He's not telling the story, right? There's no development of that plot. He's just really providing a basic description, isn't doing that those more advanced skills we would expect of plot development, of giving the character and describing the problems and the resolutions to those problems. So what value does that add? Well, one thing is it provides confirmation of that self-P data. We know that no single source of data can be used to make eligibility determination. Back in the day, all the way back in 2021, the criteria were 2 norm reference tests at 1.75 standard deviations, or a sequence of other tests. This is not much different than that, right? Where we are validating our findings across these multiple aspects. Now, I think it might be an improvement for that identification part, because we're looking at different features of language and use of language, and these tasks like repeating sentences that are really good at saying if you have low language skills. But we're also seeing this in their real life discourse, the real life production of speech, of connected speech. And like I said, for my money, where the real power comes from these tools is that we can document that educational impact, right? Not being able to repeat sentences, yeah, that's a pretty good sign of a language disorder. I don't know a lot of teachers who expect their students to repeat sentences. On the other hand, if you can't understand or produce or tell a story, if you don't have good grasp of story grammar or that story structure, it's going to be real easy to document how that's having that educational impact. And when we identify and document that educational impact, it's just going to lead very naturally into the development of meaningful treatment objectives, the development of meaningful individualized educational programs, something like plot development and stories. Additional things I think it adds value to. This is a great entry into conversations with teachers. I would have to imagine that nearly every preschool and early elementary is going to have some sort of focus on narrative. If not, then we have some broader curricular issues to address. But this is going to be something that the teachers that you're working with and your students' teachers should have a good level of comfort with. So this is going to give you some shared language. You might use slightly different terminology, but it's going to give you a shared point of entry and a shared conversation to have. The other thing is that this is a relatively feasible task, right? And there are alternate forms. There are 4 different forms of the NAP. There's a bunch of different forms of the narrative language measures. You can describe different games or sports. You can persuade on different topics. These are nice ways of monitoring progress over time to see what type of impact your therapy is having. My final thoughts on using rubrics, I wanted to just start and come out the door with something you can do, something that's feasible. You can do this, right? You can start doing this next week, and you can capture some different types of discourse. you can look at these important aspects that are related to students' daily functioning in their classroom. The other thing to take away from this is these are pretty standardized, dare I say, standardized tests. In fact, if you read that 2020 paper that Andrea shared with you, that's one of the things that we argue is that there's been a lot of research and development to show that you can collect these things in a standardized way. This isn't just willy-nilly, flying by the seat of my pants. This is legitimate, standardized, reliable assessments. At the same time, when we've developed these, and I can speak for myself as someone who's done some development in this area, we want to get them standardized, but we don't want to lose that naturalistic aspect. We don't want to lose the fact that we're capturing natural discourse, natural speech. We may not do it perfectly all the time, but that's what we're shooting for. We're shooting for something that's consistent, will be consistent over time, allow for consistent comparisons, but also is letting you see naturalistic speech. I don't want to oversell the feasibility of this. I don't want to say, you can wake up tomorrow morning and do this. These are things that require some training, they require some practice, but anything does, right? I'll talk about free lunches later. There's no free lunch. But I think it's a very reasonable ask. I think that this is something that, could be implemented next week, or you could take little bits, take off little bits of the training and do this over time. And by the end of the year, be collecting samples using these rubrics.